Hey everyone, it's Kirsty here, and you are in for a treat with this next conversation that I have with Cliff Harvey. So, Cliff is a registered clinical nutritionist, and he's also a former world champion and record strength holder athlete. So, he lives and breathes what he practices. He has also been coaching a range of people, including world athletes and also the chronically ill. And he's been doing that since the 90s. So he's really been at the forefront of this whole low carb keto space for, over 20 years. So he really understands what's going on in this space. He did his master's focusing on MCT, so medium chain triglycerides, and how that mitigates and supports and helps the keto flu and helping you to induce ketosis faster. And his PhD is focusing on looking at identifying markers that look at carbohydrate tolerance and the appropriateness of different diets to specific individuals. So he's the founder of Holistic Performance Institute, which is a private graduate college. And he is also the author of 9 books, which is incredible achievement, including the Carbohydrate Appropriateness Diet, and his upcoming release, his new one, which is the Credo, so 8 simple virtues for living with passion and purpose in the post-truth era. So he is a wealth of knowledge, and I just thoroughly enjoyed this chat with him, and I gained so much out of it. I also had the opportunity to meet Cliff in person a couple of weeks ago at the ACNAM conference, and it was incredible watching him speak at this ACNAM conference on the appropriateness of carbohydrates and the importance of low carb diets. So I really hope you enjoy this chat, and of course, if you've got any questions or you want to find out more, get in touch and let us know. So enjoy. And I'm so excited that Cliff Harvey has joined me today. Thank you, Cliff.
It's my pleasure, Kirsty.
That's an awesome looking microphone there. I feel like I have microphone envy.
The reason I bought it, they're pretty good microphones, but they look crazy too. It looks like some sort of alien device. So
I love it.
I love
it. So let's dive right on in, because the main reason why I sent out that email and hey, let's get on and let's have a chat was because of this confusion around appropriate intake of carbohydrates. And what does that look like when you're on a ketogenic diet, a cyclical ketogenic diet, using those benefits? Let's not get scared of it, but how do we know? What are the things that we need to consider?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, and it's one that's not answered very well. And I think the reason is that people get really hung up on absolutes. So you're either low carb, which typically nowadays a lot of people equate with being keto. So it's either very low carb or you're in favor of higher carb, low fat. And I think what people aren't necessarily recognizing is that there is a pretty big spectrum of carb intake in particular that will work well for the individual. So I started developing this idea of what I call carbohydrate appropriate nutrition probably 21 years ago, I think.
Wow.
Tried my first keto diet when I was a high school athlete. So that was going back about 24 years. And then by the time I was working as a student practitioner, I was putting together these ideas. And basically it came from learning, physiology, basic nutrition at university. And what we were being told didn't match up with just working out the mathematics. So we were being told at that time to prescribe around 65% of someone's calories from carbohydrate. Now, when I was working out those early diet plans, when I would allocate the optimal amount of protein for someone and then the minimum amount of fat to preserve hormonal balance and to help offset the risks of overtraining and, overreaching, overstress, the effects of that on hormones, there simply wasn't enough left to have this really high amount of carbohydrate. So that's when I started switching the way that I did it and would allocate protein first, then would allocate fat based on the outcomes that the client wanted to get. So if they were looking to lose a lot of body fat, then we would probably go higher in fat, lower in carbohydrate. And basically what was left, the remainder, was carbohydrate. And so it changed things a lot because we could see that there were some people who thrive on a slightly higher carb diet and some people who thrive on a really low carb diet. So really, in order to answer which one is more appropriate for the individual, we do need to work with the individual, but there are some things that we can see probably across the board. And that would be, if we look at the evidence now, we would say that low carb is probably still on balance better for fat loss, right? Having some additional carb in the diet is probably more beneficial if you're looking to gain muscle. And lower carb and very low carb is more appropriate if your sort of health markers are maybe not so good. So if you're more insulin resistant, maybe if you go to the doctor and your cholesterol levels are not quite where they should be, you know, those types of things, we would probably say, well, you're a real candidate for low carb. And the worse those measures are, probably the lower carb you should go. And so that's what my doctoral research was based around, was looking particularly at that. What do those baseline measures that you go in and get from your doc mean for what type of diet you should be on?
Amazing. That's incredible, because at the moment we're stuck in these standards of, you know, it should be 50 grams or it should be 100. We're stuck in these standards. And I think you've hit a beautiful point there, that it depends on you, where you've come from, your history of carbohydrates, like mine, which was just smashing down donuts and just constantly fueling carbohydrates for a lot of output and a lot of exercise. But yeah, my markers were terrible. The pain was terrible. The brain fog was terrible, all those sorts of things. So I had to flip it right around to bring all those back into line again. So it is looking at that as you as an individual encompassing this concept.
Yeah, and you bring up really two interesting threads within that. One is activity. And the strange thing was, when we were first taught basically how to prescribe nutrition, activity wasn't given the primacy that it should have had, right? If you're more active, you're obviously going to have to take in a lot more energy. Now, the interesting thing there is, if you're more active and let's say you want to be on a classic style ketogenic diet, so let's say you want to take in a minimum of 75% of your calories from fat, and we want to take in a certain amount of protein to preserve muscle and to, you know, have all those benefits of protein, improve satiety and all the various benefits of protein. If we're eating a lot more, the gram amount of carbs is going to go up as well, even though the proportion is going to be the same. So I could sort of explain it this way. If I'm eating 4,000 calories a day and 60, or let's say 80% is coming from fat, and basically the same amount is coming from protein as if I was eating less calories, there's going to be a lot more carb available than if I was eating 2,000 calories a day. And I think that's where people get hung up, because they think, well, keto means 0 carbs. Well, not necessarily. Or keto means it's got to be under 20 or under 50 or under 100. And you know what? There's very little consensus in the scientific community, and there's very little research that's been done on these things. Even if, I know I'm getting tangential here, but even if we look at what ketosis actually is, there are only there's now about 5 studies, I think, that actually determine this level of ketosis that we call nutritional ketosis, which is, for the nerds out there, over 0.5 millimoles of beta-hydroxybutyrate. And guess what? Only 2 of them were around before we started publishing our research, and the rest of them are papers that we've done. So there's really no consensus on what ketosis actually is, except that it's a diet that gets you over 0.5 millimoles. But why is that number there? We don't know exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. You sometimes question, was it just chosen because there needed to be a number there to start the conversation?
It was based on a little bit of data.
Yeah.
What basically happened, I asked the researcher Stephen Finney, who's one of the gurus of the low carb community, I asked Steve, why was this number? Why did you come up with this number? And he basically said that in their metabolic ward studies, that's when they subjectively thought that people were starting to feel better, were not really experiencing symptoms of the keto flu and things like that. So basically it was a point that they could see where people started to get past that they thought they were probably in ketosis. Then another study later on showed that people who were on what was considered a ketogenic diet were consistently over 0.5. So retroactively, we could probably say, well, yeah, that's about the level there. But I guess the point is that for the individual, it might shift a little bit. One of my colleagues, Professor Grant Schofield, one day we had a long discussion about this because he couldn't get above, at the time, about 0.4.
Okay.
And so he called me up and said, I want you to come in and have a chat about this. We looked at everything he was doing and it looked great. So I got to the point where I said, well, how do you feel? I feel great. How are you performing? Performing great. How are you sleeping? Sleeping great. I said, don't worry about it. Because the blood measure either at that point doesn't matter or it's being thrown off by other things. Maybe you're not eating enough consistently and your body's turning over those ketones really quickly. Maybe it's using them all up and so we're not having the same amount exhibited in the blood. But irrespective, at the end of the day, the most important thing is how do you feel? And if you feel great and you're getting the results you want, surely that should be the most important thing.
Absolutely. And I know from working with our clients, some prefer to be a lot deeper into ketosis, getting up to that 1, and that's their sweet spot. And other people, their sweet spot is, you know, that 0.5 or 0.6, and that's when they feel the greatest benefit. And it's fine. It's finding that balance of where you need to be.
Yeah, and that can depend a lot on the person's underlying health status as well. You know, for example, most of the early research on keto was done on children with epilepsy. And for children with epilepsy, we would say it's probably most beneficial to be over 2 millimoles. But for most other people, they don't need to be that high. But we noticed an interesting thing in some of our research, that there seemed to be a tipping point around maybe 0.9 or 1, where in the early stages of a keto diet, people did feel markedly better over that threshold. And so that's when we probably saw the big benefits in what people consistently call the keto flu. Now, before we did our research, there had actually been no papers ever that had looked specifically at the keto flu as a phenomena. And we were blown away by that. We didn't expect to be the first, because you would have thought that, you know, you do a search for keto flu and you get over 20,000 Google hits. You searched at the time, this is going back a few years now, but you searched in the scientific literature, 0, nothing. The only things that were there was sort of these adverse effects that people experience on a keto diet, but it wasn't given any definition around time or at what level of ketosis or what was actually happening. So it was pretty fascinating. That's
incredible. I've even found that in the last sort of 3 months for me. I had quite a significant head injury in my during my sport, and had a closed brain traumatic injury. And so I measured my ketones during my recovery, and I naturally, my body and everything about my recovery, I wanted to be above 2 for quite a consistent amount of time. When I dropped down to my normal sort of 1, all of the brain symptoms came back. I really struggled, and it was so fascinating. It's Dr. Peter Brunker, who you may know.
He's speaking at ACNIM. I'm speaking at ACNIM with him and Grant Schofield and others.
Exactly. And I was on a speaking tour with him about sort of 6 to 8 weeks after I had the injury. And he was like, I need to study. We've never seen anyone with concussion that was in ketosis before, and it's used it afterwards for recovery. And then I used like cryotherapy and vagal nerve stim and all this stuff to bring it back, because it was quite severe. But it was so fascinating with regards to the brain, of what my body and what my brain needed and what I naturally sort of went for, and how it helped the recovery. So when you were talking about epilepsy, and I know for my Noah, he needs to be really deep into ketosis. And whereas
neurodegenerative disorders and brain injury, I mean, neurodegenerative disorders are a brain injury, but traumatic brain injury and neurodegenerative disorders, they are really, to my mind, some of the most exciting areas for keto research right now. I know that at AUT, where I do my research, we have a PhD student who's studying the effects of ketones for concussion. We've had a lot of...
Put me in touch. I got plenty of info.
Definitely. Well, and we've had a lot of we've used it a lot clinically. So we have a lot of clinical unpublished data around athletes at the very highest level, but also, traumatic brain injury patients from car accidents and all sorts of traumas. And the results we see from not just a ketogenic diet necessarily, but any way that we can increase their levels of ketones. So whether that be with the supplements like MCTs or short chain fats, improving gut health, which improves our availability of short chain fats as well, and also exogenous ketones. I mean, those are all really exciting areas for that. And we've seen amazing results. I personally, having had a lot of brain injuries, I don't know if you know, but I was a boxer, and I'm a wrestler, and I played a lot of rugby and stuff like that. I think I've had probably, at least half a dozen diagnosed concussions, some serious, and probably more than that through, decades of fighting.
Yeah.
And I certainly know that any brain fog or brain fade is drastically improved by anything that's going to boost ketones.
Yeah.
So whether that be MCTs or exogenous ketones, or being on a keto diet.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I definitely utilize the benefits of the exogenous ketones, and it was so exciting to be able to, have this information and work with it. So let's go.
And mushrooms.
Yeah, I use them as well. That's cool.
Lion's mane?
Yep, exactly. Yep, lion's mane was the big one. I used numerous amounts because we use lion's mane for my son a lot. But yeah, look, I just, when I was a bit more coherent, it was incredible the things I went to my cupboard, and the foods and the nutrition and the things that I went for. It was quite fascinating.
Yeah.
So yeah, but definitely lion's mane. All right, so let's get into that, because you've just given a little snippet of something that, of course, I am so fascinated and love and jump into, is that whole beauty of how that gut microbiome just enhances this ability for our bodies to be in this ketogenic state, and how it supports us. So yeah, talk about, any research that is around this whole ketogenic diet and the gut.
Yeah, well, I guess there's two aspects to it. And as we discussed off air, there's not a huge amount of research at this stage on the ketogenic diet as it relates directly to the microbiota, because there's so many holes in the ketogenic research anyway, because it's still very new. There are so many things that we need to investigate more. But one thing that seems relatively clear at this point, when people first started looking at it, there was this idea, and it was shown in a few studies, that a ketogenic diet was terrible for the microbiome, right? You reduce carbohydrate and suddenly you see these massive deleterious changes to the microbiome, or what was considered to be massive negative changes to the microbiome. But then they started looking at it longer term and found that that probably wasn't the case, because that was a very short-term shift and things rebalanced relatively quickly. So past about 6 weeks, there was really no difference. But I think what we also see is a bit of a flaw in the research methodology that's been used. In the past, there was very much an idea that a keto diet was so low in carbohydrate and so very high in lipids or fat that you really couldn't allow a lot of vegetable. You couldn't have fibers and resistant starch. But of course, we know that really you can eat vegetables to your heart's content on a ketogenic diet. And the majority of what you're taking in terms of carbohydrate is going to be fiber and resistant starch, which is going to be beneficial for the microbiome. So when I hear people who are fairly anti-keto saying, oh, you can't do keto because it's bad for the microbiome because it has no fiber, that's completely ridiculous. And in fact, one of my colleagues, Karen Zinn, has done some research on this, where she's looked at the nutritional profile of a well-formulated low-carb or ketogenic diet and found it's completely sufficient in all those things, including fiber. And so that's probably one of the reasons now where we see that a ketogenic diet is certainly not detrimental to the gut microbiome, and it's probably beneficial, because a lot of the things that are common irritants, allergens, things that are directly inflammatory for the gut, or you provide some sort of endotoxicity for the gut, are removed from the diet anyway. And so you're seeing quite interesting stuff. The other angle of it is that when we have a microbiome that's working really well, and we've got those fibers and resistant starches and other cool things coming in from a ketogenic diet, they're feeding the microbiome, which is then creating more short chain fats. Now, those short chain fats like butyric acid, most of them are going to be used in the gut by other bacteria or by the epithelial cells that line the gut lining. But some of them are going to be uptaken. And they're going to enter circulation and they're going to encourage ketogenesis. A lot of them are going to go straight to the liver, and they're basically substrate that is converted almost immediately to ketones. So we actually did a review on ketogenic supplements. And one of the interesting things that hasn't got enough data behind it yet, but an interesting tangent of research, is that those short chain fats are way more ketogenic probably than, for example, medium chain triglycerides, which a lot of people use to support a keto diet. And that makes sense because really the shorter the chain, the more likely it is to go to the liver as compared to the normal lymphatic uptake and be used to produce ketones. So that's cool because we've basically got this dual thing now where we know that a ketogenic diet is not bad for the microbiome and maybe better than most other diets anyway. I mean, particularly standard American style diets. And we've got benefits to ketogenesis, benefits to keto adaptation, benefits to fat adaptation from having a healthy functional microbiome too.
Yeah, I feel, and I just absolutely agree with you that I feel like there's this confusion about the ketogenic diet of just have your shakes, get yourself into ketosis and off you go. And yes, that would absolutely starve the microbiome, but it's not as cut and dry as that. And this is where I just see the beauty of fermented foods. I mean, you can ferment anything and bring down that carbohydrate load from fermenting it. And then there's your fiber and there's your resistant starches. And you've got all these incredible properties like sauerkraut, for example. Like there's just, and your gut doesn't have to miss out and you don't have to worry. I'm so close. I'm doing all the packaging at the moment for the very, very first, it's called diversity dough. So I'm developing a culture starter, which is to make like sourdough bread, but it's all resistant starches and fibers for the gut.
Wow.
You ferment your bread, so you bring down those carbs, but then you've just got all that diversity and all the fiber, so you can make some breads and things. Just hang on, the gardener, of course, is turned up. There we go. A little bit better. So it's just that whole concept of, right, let's use fermenting to change the state of that food, but use all the benefits and the nutrients and the fiber and the minerals and continue to nourish our bodies as opposed to this real cut and dry, you know, I've got to do this or I've got to do that.
Yeah, it's an interesting area now because, you know, obviously we stopped for a long time fermenting as much as our forebears did. And I'm talking about our recent forebears. But for the entire existence, and you know this, but obviously, you know, this is interesting stuff. For the entire existence of our species and our forebear species, we've basically had fermented foods as part of what we eat and fermented beverages. And so we've never not had them. And one of the really interesting things that I'm sure you've seen in the research lately is that, you know, for a little while there, everyone was focused on probiotics, supplementing with probiotic capsules and things. And I think what we're beginning to see now in the research, which I think is really, really cool, is that the symbiotic idea of naturally fermented things that include pre, pro, and postbiotics in a living ecosystem are proving to be more effective. And so I had a talk on my podcast just a couple of weeks ago with Phil Dowling, who's a sort of microbiome expert from New Zealand. Great guy. He's one of my old colleagues. We used to teach together at a naturopathic college. And he knows more than anyone I know personally about the microbiome. And he's so big on ferments and the living complexes, as am I, because they just seem to be so much more effective. And they have all these other benefits too. We're not just taking something in isolation. As you mentioned, you've got reduction in, you know, that sugar content, that carbohydrate content, but then you might have higher levels of resistant starch because that's part of the complex, because that's what the bacteria are feeding on. Plus you've got the postbiotics, which is the short chain fats like acetic acid and butyric acid, which are really good for us for a whole bunch of reasons. And then often in these, fermented foods as well, we get better bioactivity of a lot of the nutrients and other ancillary compounds as well. So we're really getting a lot of complex benefit that we simply can't get from just taking one thing in isolation.
No, and it's food, and you share it with your friends and family, and it's not, $100 a bottle for some probiotics. It's like, dropping in the ocean kind of stuff. And that's what I was seeing all these fibers coming out, costing $100 a pop. Put this fiber in, false and then inulin and all this kind of stuff. I was like, no, we can do this with food. Let's get a culture starter that's got all of like green banana flour and all these incredible different types of ingredients, and we can use them, and then we can just get back in the kitchen and use food to nourish us. And like you said, feed everything, this whole ecosystem. And we're getting back to those basics again, as opposed to come and line up, you need your next tablet. And it's just not going to work. It's not sustainable, and no one can afford that anyway, to have all the tablets and all the rest of it. So yeah. Oh, you're singing my song. I love that. So it's really exciting, and I totally agree with you. I think there's going to be this incredible explosion of research around what is a functional ketogenic diet that supports both, the gut, and also supports the brain and supports changing our markers and all of these sorts of things that we want and utilize. So it's just up to you guys to crack that whip and get that study out. So, alrighty.
I hope as well that there will be a bit more pragmatism brought to the field, because, you mentioned before that, we're getting back to food. I hope we're getting back to food. And that really explains so much of what we need to do is get back to food. For most people, if they stick to a diet that is based on natural, whole, unrefined foods, they'll be fine. Generally. Now, some people obviously need to quantify a little bit more. Some people might want to be on a keto diet versus a more, moderate carb diet, whatever. And there's obviously clinical conditions for that. And there's also other stuff, psychosocial, psycho-emotional things, what our behaviors fit best with, all that kind of stuff. But the first step always needs to be food. And often in academia and research, people forget that.
Yeah.
And people might be, some of my co-researchers might think, well, Cliff oversimplifies by saying, well, the first step is food and eating natural, unrefined food. But it's really not, because if we can take care of most things doing that, I can nerd out with the best of them about quantities and all the biochemistry and stuff, but that's not going to get cut through with people either.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose to break it down even further, if you're not committing to the food and you're embracing it and bringing it into your life and making it your absolute number one commitment, nothing else is going to work, because you won't have that commitment. It's not a quick fix pill. And
exactly.
And I just don't think there's the support in this current environment for people to change to this beautiful, nurturing diet that needs to happen. I get this feedback. I mean, I was just at the Mind Forum speaking on the weekend in Sydney, and I can't change my son's diet to what you're suggesting. He only eats white food, or she only eats white food, and I could never do this and I could never do that, and my friends don't accept that this is what we're doing, and all the roadblocks and the barriers, and I'm a bit full on. I'm like, well, who's feeding that child that food? It's you. And are you eating it? And, we sort of have to go back to that sort of emotional connection, and how do we celebrate food with our friends and not be scared to say, hey, I'm going to introduce some ferments into my life. Like, people are like, their friends and family are traumatized by the thought that they might serve some sauerkraut on the table. Like, you've gone hippie, I'm like, it's like, no, we've just gone back to the beginning again. We haven't gone anywhere. So
exactly.
There's so many social barriers that we need to break down, that we align with food. And what's, literally, clients will say, oh, my family thinks I'm weird. Now that breaks my heart, that eating vegetables is considered weird. So
yeah, that's why clinically, I've always said I don't work with children. Now, it doesn't mean I don't work to help children, but I don't work with children because what I work with is families. Work with families and work with food environments, because you know that the research is pretty clear. If you have good food in the house and you let the kids go for it, they will eat the right things. They'll basically self-choose and they'll begin to auto-regulate, just like we will if we've got good food available. Of course, that's challenging in the case of autism spectrum disorder and other challenges that we might have, but it's doable. And I often think that the responsibility that people take, they're not prepared to take with their families sometimes, or let members of their family take that responsibility either, because it's put in the too hard basket. You know, any of us who have faced health challenges have had to make some pretty bold decisions to change, but the effects and the benefits are obviously well worth it. So I really do think that changing the environment of food that we are, associated with is the biggest part of that. And the first point, obviously, is to have good, nourishing food available in the home. And that doesn't mean we can't have treats. I always work with my clients on having treats as well, but those are expeditions. Those are things you might go out to get. You especially get that because you really want to enjoy it. That's cool. That works because that's consistent with any type of diet you want to be on anyway. Whether it's keto, whether it's low carb, whether it's Mediterranean, it works with treats. The key is to have a structure overlying that where you can exercise that freedom without pushing yourself way off balance. And again, that just comes down to having those good things available to you.
Yeah. And what's considered a treat? So, you change the biome in your mouth. So, you've got beneficial microbes in there. Suddenly what used to be considered a treat, like your Krispy Kremes, turns into like a beautiful, nourishing chocolate that you've made yourself with all of the, the really good quality ingredients. So even that, it's incredible when I work with my clients and they're like, wow, I couldn't even think about even eating that now because just the thought of it's so chemical. So.
Yeah, things do change. I mean, and that's one of the really interesting things that we're working on a lot is this idea of auto-regulation, because defining what you do and being overly controlling of your behaviors simply doesn't work. We need to obviously have responsibility. We need to exercise some control, but we also need to be working in concert with our physiology. And when we've got both those things working from top and the bottom, that's when we get the best results. And so we can't work against the physiology just by saying, well, you eat too much and you've got a portion control. We need to provide the things that allow us to be properly satiated, to be comforted by food, all those important things. And that comes from the microbiome. It comes from having, enough nutrients overall. So, veggies and berries and all the good stuff, enough protein, enough essential fats, all those various things. And that really comes from eating a nourishing, nutrient-dense diet. When people do that, they're often surprised how well they auto-regulate the amount they eat.
Yeah. And then they're not searching because, they're just searching for nutrients because they're so deficient in whatever's available. And obviously often that's not the best choice. And it's just that education. I mean, I was brought up on meat and 3 veg and scones and all of those sorts. I just didn't know that there was all these other beautiful options out there to nourish my body until I had to learn the hard way. Yeah. So, or the fun way, the good way. I mean, when you're faced with adversity, you certainly learn. There's no other way. So I'd love to learn a little bit more about your own personal experience. You touched on it just before about your, fighting and your martial arts and those sorts of things. And so is there anything that you wanted to comment on about your own personal journey? And have you finished all of that research and where are you going now? Like what are you focusing on at the moment?
Yeah, it's an interesting point now because I'm moving back a lot into the mind-body side of things, not exclusively, of course. Nutrition's my passion, but I started my postgrad journey in mind-body healthcare. And so I've started moving back into research in that area as well, but that's also led to me reinvestigating a lot of things. And one of the aspects of that, for example, my next book that's coming out is called the Credo, and it's really about how we live life versus what we eat.
Yeah.
And a big part of that process was actually telling my story, because I've told little parts of it throughout my career. I've been doing this now for 22 years, and I've told parts of my story, but never synthesized it, because I never wanted my story to be first and foremost. A lot of times we look at these health influencers and it's all about my journey. I've always thought it was more important, the journey that I was helping someone on, because I had learned things from my journey, but I didn't want to make that the thing. But it's been interesting, because I think it is important to have that out there, and for people to understand that you are coming from some depth of experience, and you've actually been through some things and transcended it, or you work with it at least. I don't like the idea of transcendence or curing or anything. You work with it and you manage to live a really good life. So, I mean, I guess really where my stuff started, and obviously people can read the book when it comes out to get the whole story.
Yeah,
but
I'm looking forward to it.
I had a lot of challenges that have sort of tempered both where I've gone in education and what I've done clinically, ranging from, pretty severe depression as a kid and through teenage years. I was then later as an adult diagnosed with bipolar disorder and Crohn's disease, as a lot of people know. So I've worked very much with the gut-brain connection, even if I didn't always realize I was doing that. A lot of the overall health and wellness things I was doing were geared towards that. I also had an interesting upbringing, because I was very much engendered into spirituality as a kid, but it wasn't necessarily theistic. My mum, who was a devout Christian, bought me all sorts of books on Eastern philosophy and all that kind of stuff. My dad, who was a marathon runner, got me into yoga when I was a little kid, just by the fact that he was doing it for flexibility, and then realized it was a lot more than flexibility.
Yeah.
And I started copying him when I was about 3 years old. So now we're going back 37 years.
Yeah.
And since then, those things, meditation, yoga, they've always been a part of what I do. And so over the years, I managed to bring a lot of the mind-body things that I had learned just from being out there, but also mind-body things from modality work that I'd done, Reiki, Psych K, all these weird and wonderful things, into my practice as well. So I was very much astride both the science and the holism, because I felt that they weren't contradictory. Holism is looking at the whole person, and I had to look at my whole person in order to function. But I also had to help the whole person as my client. And science is the way we explain that. So science is the evidence that backs that up. So I've always strived to be a holistic practitioner who looks at the whole person and any method that might help that person thrive, so long as it has strong evidence, because I feel like the evidence helps to make us safer and more effective as a practitioner. So it's interesting now, because really what I'm doing from this point on is a couple of things. I obviously want to continue to flesh out the areas of the research that really need attention. My passion obviously is in researching things and then explaining them to the public. But also along with that, we really want to make a bigger impact with people who have not been served well yet. So often, as you would have seen, and, we see this so often, that we're very much speaking to, dare I say it, the worried well, who are, now that's not meant to be disparaging either, because we also work with a lot of people who have very serious conditions and complaints, and everyone is looking to thrive, and it's very difficult to do that in the modern environment. What I mean by that, though, is that often it's people who can afford complementary healthcare that get it. And there's a lot of people who are left out. And that's why we have a real disparity in health outcomes. You have it in Australia, it's definitely there in most other Western countries. We certainly have it in New Zealand. And so we really want to work on methods that we can help to get really good information out to those people who really need it and can't afford it.
Yeah. And that's certainly my passion in the autism space, because currently the kids with diagnosis where the parents can afford the extra care are getting it, and the other, there's kids that don't. And I absolutely agree with you on that. And that's where the beauty of science comes into it. You
Yeah.
just keep bringing that knowledge forward. So the frontline care, it's suddenly just the new normal. And
Exactly.
that's what I want. That's my joy of, you know, my greatest passion. I have many, but a family or someone who's got a chronic illness, and not an acute illness, a chronic illness, walks in and their frontline practitioner is able to say, oh, here's your Medicare approved gut microbiome test that you have. And I know how to read it, and I can support you on the best way to fuel your body so we can change that. And I know how to read your bloods. So we look at all of the different markers, and yeah, and it's just getting that front line. And to do that is what you do. You've got, the science has to be there to make it that frontline care. So we'll get there. We will get there. We just...
And I think there are communities growing around that. You know, you mentioned before that often there's not the support for people, and I think that's correct, but I think the support is growing. And what we've certainly seen here is that the support is growing from the ground up.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of us have become really frustrated with trying to institute top-down change. You know, to get institutionalized change is really difficult, but to get people excited in communities, you know, we've got a lot of GPs, for example, now who are really embracing both, you know, low carb, lower carb, the microbiome. We've got communities that are growing around that. You know, I know that in Aussie, you've got a lot of those as well. You know, I was talking with my good buddy, Scott Gooding, across there. And I know that he's been very active in trying to, you know, provide that type of support to people as well. I don't know if you know Scott, you probably do.
Yeah, I do, yeah.
So yeah, there are a lot of things happening there. And I think that will just continue to grow because it must.
Yeah, absolutely. And your span of, you know, that sort of 22 years, it must be really exciting for you to see this incredible change of, we're preparing our new workshop series of, I'm interviewing some microbiologists, and one of my media team said to me, oh, we can't say this because no one knows about it. And I was like, I saw in Women's Weekly the other day the word gut microbiome. We are on this, like it's, and you would have seen, I mean, I've been in this space for 10 years, but you would have seen such an incredible change in embracing it, which I just find so exciting.
Oh, and just the amount of information that is out there. You know, when I got into clinical practice, if you were really into nutrition, you were kind of weird. Now everybody's into nutrition. Everyone's taking snaps of their food. It's all over Instagram. You know, it's such a ubiquitous thing. And there are challenges within that as well, because I think we can develop problematic behaviors. You know, we obviously have a big challenge around disordered eating and things like that. But on the other hand, people know so much more than they ever have about the body, about health, about wellness. And I think so long as we have advocates out there who are, you know, acting with integrity and who are really trying to do the best and are scientifically literate, I think that the sky's the limit, really. I think we're on the cusp of some pretty big changes.
Yeah.
You know, speaking at organizations like ACNIM that I mentioned before, that's been a real eye-opener for me, because never before have I walked into a room of, you know, GPs and oncologists and had a message that I've been promoting, which is holistic, but it's also consummately evidence-based, just be so embraced.
Yeah.
And it gives you real hope, because there was a little time there where I was kind of thinking it's getting a bit old being out on the periphery and everyone's saying you're going to kill people with this lower carb stuff.
Yeah, I know, it's wonderful. The president of ACNIM on the weekend asked me to do a webinar with her about, you know, what we do at Cultured Wellness and how we implement the dietary changes. And yeah, that certainly wouldn't have been on the cards years ago. So I totally agree with you. It's just so fantastic. And not to be, I just think the message is to not be scared and be informed and be that critical thinker to work out what's best for you and find that practitioner that understands you and what's best for you. And like you said at the start, you know, making those adjustments that work for you.
Yeah. And I think one of the key things with finding a practitioner is you got to find someone who's prepared to go on the journey with you, you know, to investigate and to speak with you, not to you. and to really understand you, and then to basically work with you to create the best way forward, and then adjust that. I think so often we've been indoctrinated into a position where we go to a doc, for example, and they just say, okay, it's 10 minutes. You go and you quickly parrot off what's wrong with you. A few quick things here, bang, gone. And then you don't see them again for a long time. That's changing as well, I think, because people want more. They want more advice. They want more guidance. They want more support. And that they need to also be empowered within their own journey. It's not enough to just devolve that to somebody else.
Yeah. It's certainly something that we're passionate about at Culture Wellness. Like, we don't work with anyone unless we're in a long time program with them. And and our practitioners can work with them on adjusting and making sure that we're getting those things right. So, yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. Well, I could absolutely talk to you all day, but I don't want to take any more of your time. So thank you so much. I'm so grateful for you joining us today. And I will put all of the information on where to find you, where to read all about you, and follow on and hear more about your journey. When's the book out, by the way?
Good question. I'm not sure. I only decided to write it, or it was there in structure, but I decided to finish it off about a month ago. So I'm just finishing it now. Should be out probably in about 3 months.
Okay. We'll hold you to that.
Yeah. Parkinson's law.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Kirsty. You guys are doing great work over there.
Thank you.